Well, welcome everyone to the JVM Lunch. This is, I think, the second real official kind of meet-up since lockdown. We had a brief one to talk about some ideas. Last month we had the Adopt OpenJDK team on, which was great. And so yeah, this time we've got Jim Gough who's joining us, and we'll obviously talk to Jim a bit more in a moment. But yeah, I mean, the JVM Lunch essentially it's supposed to be like a fairly kind of informal, conversational meet-up. We all get together, talk about things that have been happening in the Java industry and ecosystem, and just kind of keep in touch really across the Manchester Java community, and also stretching a bit further now, which is great. That's I suppose the nature of remote meetups. That reach grows. So yeah, I suppose kind of introducing Jim to. So thanks Jim for joining us. So Jim's been involved in the Java community for quite a good few years, and we'll talk to Jim a bit about his background. Jim's been up to the Manchester Java community before. He did a talk around how the JVM optimizes Java, if that's the right title. So that was a great talk. We've seen Jim at JMank as well in the past. That was cool. So a few of you may know his face already. But for those who don't, Jim, would you like to kind of introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, cool. So hey, Jim. Yeah, I'm from Huddersfield originally. So coming past the Manchester Java user group is usually a trip home or a trip up to see family and friends. So try and combine those things together. So yeah, it's great to actually be able to participate without having to get a train. Like that's probably one of the plus sides of everything. Right now, I mean, we could go into like detail, but right now I'm working as a Java developer at a company called Morgan Stanley. So building out API infrastructure. So do a lot of stuff with things like Spring Cloud Gateway, building out APIs and REST APIs, and kind of plumbing all of the products and pieces together. So lots of Java in there, lots of things like TDD, which I'm a big advocate for. And yeah, just like Java's kind of it's interesting. It's something I do at work, but it's also my hobby. So there's different things that I do there that I can talk about too.
Yeah, that's cool. So I suppose going back then to the beginnings. How did you actually get into Java? What was your route into?
Going back to the beginning. Okay, this could be. I was thinking about this question earlier. I think it could be a long answer. So my sort of like going right back to the beginning. I started programming when I was 6 on a Commodore 64. So my parents bought me this thing primarily, I think, to play games on, and they didn't realize that I guess I was going to take that and start like trying to hack things together to like play music on the sound card and sort of generally learn basic things like this. So I learned basic. I can't say I wrote any well-structured code in those days, but certainly like I quite enjoyed it. Like I liked being able to get that feedback that you get from just running a program, and it does like the commands that you told it. And I learned some very early on, I learned a lot of basics about programming. And I remember saying to somebody at school, like I was probably only 7 or 8, I said, "Oh, how do you program like a Windows machine? Like, how do you write? Because I could do this on my C64, but how?" And it was, "Oh, I don't think you can." It was, "Oh, what would you want to do that for?" So I kind of dropped it for a little bit, really. And then I was when I was 16, 17, going to college. Our college did a sort of A-level in computing, and I think that's when I really got back into it. So we've been doing obviously like IT at school. Which wasn't much more than fixing printers and playing with Lego from what I can remember. And then we we went on to Pascal and Delphi, which was the kind of like the C# UI on top of Pascal, which is really cool. Wrote a few stuff there. And I realized I wanted to be a programmer. I wanted to be a developer, I guess. And I did this thing which you obviously all do when you're doing careers advice, is I go and say, what do I need to do computer science? It's like, oh, you need to do maths, physics, and computing. So that's what I did. And then I went to Warwick University and they used Java there. So that was like kind of my first real exposure to the language. It was still on 1.4 at the time. And I guess like when I started that course, like I really got into building software in Java. It was one of those 4 years where you learn a lot about computer science and maths and a little bit about programming. Like doing a computer science degree doesn't necessarily make you a good developer. And I was lucky enough to do like an internship down in a bank in London for 10 weeks where I built some software with some really gnarly APIs and stuff that you wouldn't expect to do. And I just really enjoyed it. Even though it was gnarly, I probably got stuck into it. And I decided that's what I wanted to do after university. Obviously not knowing at the time that when I signed up to this, I go back as a .NET developer. So for 6 months, I was a .NET developer. Now, most people don't know that, but as it's the Manchester Java User Group, I could share these extra secrets. So I was a .NET developer for 6 months, where I got interested in things like garbage collection. And one of the things that I had to do was optimize the efficiency of our C# application to like not be using heaps and heaps of memory. So there was kind of a few things in there. But at the time, I was still like, I really want to get back into Java. You know, I've just done all this time like learning all of the lower level details. Like, how can I do this? And I ended up listening to a podcast called the Java Posse, which a few of you may have heard of. It doesn't exist anymore, but that was like really inspirational in keeping me going with Java and sort of like the bits around it really. And the company that I worked for, they did a 15-week training program. So I got to go to New York for 6 weeks, which is pretty cool. I can't say how much I learned in those 6 weeks. It was one of those things where actually it was intense, but it was intense in the way that we were always studying, but also studying in bars and studying in the office. It was really cool. But I learned a lot of Java during that time, and there's some really great trainers on that program. And then I came back to the UK, finished off that, and then worked in a team that worked with sort of trade flow software. So financial software really. And obviously this was around 2008, and that was not a good time to work for a bank in general. Like the financial crisis was just hitting. And I got sent out to New York again for 3 months to program in Java and was literally programming to, I guess, keep a system working during probably like the busiest, people were doing things manually. And if we hadn't got this software ready in 3 months, they wouldn't have been able to cope with the volumes that were going to happen at the end of the 3 months. So that was really cool, really hectic, but a use of like just bringing everything together that I'd learned to date. But I still missed something. There was something really important that I wasn't doing at this time, which was community. Like, so there wasn't a London Java community when I first moved to London. I didn't know about the New York Java community because honestly, I had no. There was no things on the phone. It was really difficult to look things up and that kind of thing. So I then in the end came back to London, and there was the London Java User Group had a unconference, and it was the first unconference. So I mean, I also had I was a bit nervous about going to a user group for the first time. Like can be quite daunting, like just stepping in, and especially if we're an unconference with like 80 or 90 people there. And I don't know how much I know. Like it's always the scary thing. But I ended up going, and I had a really great day. And I remember explicitly because I met a guy there called Ben Evans, who some of you will have heard of or know. And I saw this guy, and I'm like, I know him. Why do I know him? Like, he's familiar. And it turns out he was familiar because he interviewed me for my first job. So I just walked straight up to Ben and said, I've been having nightmares about you for 3 years. And then he's like, oh, I remember you from Morgan Stanley. And then he's like, yeah, okay, cool. And we've been really good friends since and gone on to write books together, which I can sort of get onto. So yeah, that was great. I mean, the LJC was then this new part of what I did, and I was doing my stuff at work day to day, but I was going home and sort of experimenting with Java a little bit in my spare time. And this initiative called Adopt a JSR came around, and it was like really what the LJC was trying to do was be more involved in the decisions that the Java community and the Java community process, the JCP, were making on the platform. Because if you've ever looked at the JCP, like 95% of the members are big companies. They're not developers, and that just seemed wrong. And Sue Java and the LJC both kind of went on to sit on the panel on the Java Executive Committee to help try and navigate this whole ecosystem and to try and contribute at a code level some stuff towards the process. So this was when I kind of went from just going to the community meetups to starting to really contribute, I would say. So JSR 310, which was the date time library in Java, some of you may have come across it. It's in java.time is the package, and previously it was like java-util.date was and calendar was the things that you had, and they weren't particularly nice. So actually Stephen Colburn, who's the spec lead, he got quite far like with Joda time in terms of designing what would be the reference implementation. There were some changes that we learned from Joda time that we wanted to apply to the main product. So I kind of worked with Stephen and a guy called Richard Warburton from the LJC to, first of all, just evangelize what JSR 310 was all about. So why are we trying to do this, and what's the API going to take the shape of? We had another project to separate out tests. So we were moving TCK tests and implementation tests to apart, so that you could do like low-level tests, but also check that an implementation is Java standards compliant, which is what the TCK does. So we did that kind of separation. We spoke at Java 1 about it. So I ended up like, this was my route into speaking, really. And I was kind of talking to someone earlier, and I was saying, actually, I was really nervous about talking about anything technical in the past. And this was a really great way into doing like a small lightning talk about JSR 310. That led into a 30-minute talk, which then ended up in an hour talk. And given that I've probably been talking about 8 minutes now, I sort of fill the time quite well. It's smaller talks that are hard. Don't let anybody trick you. The smaller talks are the hardest. So yeah, I ended up doing that, and it was really cool. I ended up being involved on the EC. So I was on the executive committee at the time. We were meeting with Oracle. We were trying to get this stuff into Java 8. And by far, like the best thing that came out of that was we were on a call with the EC. We sat in San Francisco in the Bay Area in the Oracle office, and Stephen Colburn said to the EC, "It's like, look, if it wasn't for the efforts of the London Java community and Jim and Richard, like this library would not be in Java 8." So that was like really cool. Like that to me was one of like my proudest moments within the Java community, was actually to have been able to contribute directly to such an important language feature getting into Java 8. And as the release cadence of Java has changed, like that was such a big thing back then. It's like now it's like, well, get it in the next release, it'll be fine. But these things end over like 5 years rather than 5 minutes apart. So you had to, it was kind of a big thing to make that deadline, so to speak. And then I got addicted to talking to people. So going from not liking to talk about anything to not being able to stop talking, I ended up taking a job which was a change in direction for me completely, as a technical trainer and a technical writer. So I went to a company that did specialist training, who trained me actually on my graduate program that I mentioned, and I taught Java, C++, C#, and Python, and a bit of JavaScript. So I did kind of like a whole array of things really, which was cool, in different offices. So I traveled, I think I went to New York, India and China were the countries that I spoke in mainly, or cities. And then I think I only spent 2 days in London during that time, which was kind of a lot of travel. And then I went to work for Bloomberg, and I was a C++ trainer. And I never really I'd been interested in C++ from the perspective of it's a very good way to learn what's under the hood in Java, and a very good way to learn about like low level details. So I learned a lot about that to be able to teach it, and to teach it effectively. I taught to, like, it's also those daunting days where somebody says to you, "Oh, this person's joining your training class." Like, who is this person? I've not heard of them. "Oh, well, they're on the C++ standards committee, Jim. Like they'll know the ins and outs." I was okay, and they were all really decent people. It's such a good laugh in those classrooms where if you ever assume you're the smartest person in the room, you're in for a downfall. is the way I always view it. So like, yeah, that kind of collaborative training is something that we really got into.
You probably learn as much as you teach, essentially, in those kind of sessions, I imagine.
Yeah, definitely. In some ways, you become a little bit more like a facilitator, and it's important that you pick up on the key points and that you emphasize the parts that you think people should be learning, because you still want to teach the narrative and the story that you're trying to get across. But people adding contributions in and like bringing in their own experience is by far the best way to teach people, because in about 2 more minutes, and that's why I'm going to stop talking, Like everybody will be doing something else. So that's the they were lost. Attention spans are very short, which is rightfully so at lunchtime. So yeah, I know. Then I went back to being a developer, mainly because it gave me a bit more flexibility to be able to work from home a bit, be with my family a bit more. Because when I was traveling, I was away quite a lot, and it also allowed me to get back to being a Java dev. And as much as I enjoyed training and teaching C++, it wasn't really where my passion was. I still did things for the LJC during this time, and actually during that time, I also wrote a book on Java, optimizing Java, which is a book about core Java performance, which was something that myself and Ben, when we were teaching a class together, we said, wouldn't it be great if we could write all this stuff down so that other people could learn it without having to necessarily be in a classroom with us, but also just to demystify the fact that performance tuning is only for real experts. Like, it was to really say, hey, if you have an approach, you can make your application better. And that was the main objective of the book, really. So after that, I went back to being a software developer. Everything had changed. Like, things like Docker existed, and because I'd been working on low-level C++, I was like, "What? Docker what?" And I said, "Oh yeah, there's this thing called Kubernetes." It's like, "Kuba what?" And it's like there's all these things. And I went to a really great conference, an architecture conference, and the first time you go to one of those things, your knowledge goes from somewhere like here to up here, because everybody's talking about the latest and greatest, and you're thinking, this is just amazing. And it was a really good opportunity to learn more. So I mentioned, we do work on APIs. And I'm actually, after finishing optimizing Java, I was like, yes, the book is finished. This is the best thing I've ever done. I'm not doing it again. And the next thing that happened was, hey, Jim, would you like to write a book on APIs? I was like, nah, I'm not so sure. It's a lot of work. And then I ended up talking to a guy called Daniel Bryant, and we'd actually met at a few conferences over time. And I know Daniel's spoken at Manchester Java User Group before as well. And if he hasn't, he's under pressure to speak now. So we'd had a couple of conversations, and we actually realized we had a lot of overlapping knowledge in this space, really. So we decided to write a book, and that's something that we're actively working on now, which is really cool.
All right, yeah, no, that is cool. So you're going to be sacrificing some of your precious free time then, I imagine, to focus on that over the next year or so.
Yeah, I would say it comes down to sacrificing sleep at this point. That's definitely going to be how that one works. So no, I mean, I think if you're going to take on a new project outside of work, so I mean, obviously, I kind of talked about these hobby projects, and we've got a lot to do. Like a software developer, or wherever you are in technology, like if you're working from home and doing 9 hours a day at the moment, it's really difficult to kind of go off and have some dinner and then come back and do something else. So if you're going to do something like that, you've got to be really kind of smart with the time and make sure it can be focused. And the way that we're planning on writing the book, we're taking a different approach to it, which I'm happy to share with people. Like, the plan is that we're going to do, on every chapter, we're going to do a presentation first. So we actually get to establish what the content is going to look like for the chapter, what the kind of like research that we need to do would look like, and any sample applications that we need to build, and also what the narrative is. And for like, from technical writing experience, the writing part is difficult, but it's even more difficult if you don't know what you're going to write. So we're kind of trying to take a step back and structure our chapters and present our chapters first to get that real-time feedback, to get that quick feedback. And the way I kind of like think of it is it's like writing software. You want to do like a small sample, test it, then make it more complex or make it longer. And that's one of the ways we're trying to short circuit the feedback loop for writing and apply some of these methodologies to writing.
No, it's an interesting approach. Is that kind of something that you, as a group of writers, have kind of come up with as an idea to kind of experiment with to see how it helps you write the book, or is it a kind of a tried and tested approach that people are doing?
I don't know if it's necessarily tried and tested. I couldn't speak to what other authors do. In terms of like what we did was, like, both Daniel and I have written books before. Matt Alban, who's working on the book with us, it's his first time writing a book. So what we said was, well, there's 3 authors. How are we going to try and get a consistent narrative, consistent voice, understand what we're doing across the book in a way that's not just sitting down and reading the book cover to cover? So what we said was, well, this is a great way for us to just share our ideas. And we also want to be able to do things like present training courses or Jug talks, Java user group talks off the back of the content that we have, because it just unlocks a lot more potential for where the material can be sort of disseminated to the audience. So yeah, we're really kind of trialing it. We're going to trial it for the first 3 chapters. It's an experiment. Assuming it works for the first 3 chapters, we will continue to roll it out across the different parts of the book. But the nice thing is that if the solutions are there and the sample problems are there, we can actually do some of the sort of like workshop style sessions that Nick, you've also helped us work on some API workshops before, where we're able to talk a little bit about the content and then have people work on smaller katas or active hands-on learning, as opposed to absorb. It's actually, absorb a bit, do a bit, absorb a bit, do a bit. It makes the workshop quite effective in terms of pace.
That's very cool. And of course, you'll be welcome to kind of test that out with us here at the Manchester Java community when you're ready.
Yeah, we'd love to. And certainly like we're looking for feedback on whether the narratives work and whether people would add in other things or take things out. So that, if you think about it, that once you've committed the text, that's the point where it's more difficult to change. Whereas when you've got a couple of slides, it's really easy to shuffle around and make things sort of work for you.
Yeah, no, that's cool. So yeah, I suppose kind of thinking about taking the conversation back a little bit, because I'm kind of being involved in the Manchester Java community. That's kind of become a big kind of part of my Java career. And some of the stuff you were saying about you went to the London Java Community on Conference, and that sounds like, well, your career was kind of progressing really well, almost like a kind of pivotal moment, essentially, of trajectory, kind of meeting people like Ben Evans, kind of getting exposure to the other people with the same passion as you, essentially. And to kind of relate my experience to that, it's very similar in some ways, because I was lucky enough to go to JCrete probably like 5 or so years ago now, and it was just a really great experience. I met some amazing people, and I remember, I think it was the year after DevOps UK, Heinz Kabutz introduced me to yourself, and there was that through the community we made this connection, and then we met up again at another, I think it was another one conference, which was JAlba, and yeah, just hit it off, and kind of, it's similarly to you that kind of there's been a number of things that then started to happen in my career and the trajectory. And I think it's just being involved in kind of communities like this is really good. I think it can make a huge difference to I suppose to kind of what you get out of your career. But I think there is a difficult step there, which is putting yourself out there in the first place. And I think you touched on that. It's scary. I think kind of going to that first conference, me heading out to JCrete, I was like, I'm going to go and meet all these people. These are like experts in the field. I'm just me. What's going to happen? But then the kind of reality is that, there's just this friendly group of people, and they're all kind of really there to help each other. I don't know much about other communities, but I've definitely found that in the Java community. It seems to be a very supportive community, kind of globally, essentially. Wherever you go, there's a jug, and there's people who are going to welcome you into that community and either support you to speak or just as an attendee. Does that kind of relate to your experience in some ways?
Yeah, so there's a few things in there that I'd definitely like to touch on. So first of all, like the Java community is one of the best communities, I think. There are other communities that they're good, but I find that consistently with the Java community, it's just an amazing experience. Like at the beginning of the year, I was lucky enough before lockdown and everything else to get over to New York, and I had a presentation to do at QCon, and I'd changed some slides and I'd worked on it, and the QCon organizer said to me, it's like, we know that you're a good speaker, but do you want to do a practice run? I was like, no, not really. I hadn't really thought about doing a practice run. You know me, Nick. I'm just like, I'll just put the deck together and it'll be fine. I thought, well, actually, I want to think about this a bit more. It's QCon. It's the first QCon I spoken at. I want to do a really good job of it. And I pinged a guy who runs the New York Java user group. And I said, hey, the New York Special Interest Group. I said, I'd really like to kind of maybe present this to you because you run the user group. And Frank said, I'll tell you what, I can see if we can get a slot. And I kid you not, like getting a slot in a finance company is really difficult. And a lot of the jugs in New York are based in financial institutions just because of location. Mm-hmm. And he managed to get a slot in Credit Suisse, I think it was, like at a specific time. And loads of people turned up, and it was like at 4 or 5 days notice. And I presented the talk I was going to give at QCon, and afterwards I went out with the people. We had a few beers and we had a chat, and it was brilliant. Like just the reception and the fact that they managed to squeeze my talk in, and they were thanking me for giving the talk. I'm like, no, thank you for having me give this talk. And a few people came up with some really great questions, really great points. And I changed the material, like not significantly, but I did change the way I presented parts of it and the way I explained some of it. And then I went to QCon, and if you've not been to QCon, there's like this whole rating system that they do, and it's very good compared to other conferences, because as you leave the room, you tap green, amber, or red, and it gives you like they give you the figures, and you know like what the audience thought of your talk. And I think I on that talk I ended up getting 95% thumbs up and 5% that was okay, and that was great. I mean, I don't think I would have done that without the community, and I think to your point, like the same with the Manchester Java user group, everybody's really accommodating and putting time into trying to get stuff that people can use to improve like their own, like whether it's personal development, communication, whatever you want to get, you can find a supportive person in the community for that. And I just wanted to touch on one other thing, because what resonated with me was you said like, oh, your career was on a good trajectory. Probably yes, but in terms of like would it have been something that I'd still want to do now if I hadn't got like these additional interests and things that I really enjoy doing along with software development? I actually wonder, and I couldn't say this 100%, whether I'd still be working in software development now if it wasn't for like Java community, because yeah, I'd have been doing well within the company that I worked in, but things that I was trying to do, I was struggling with. I'll give you one example. I did lots of testing using JUnit. I think I remember trying to show people what JUnit was when we didn't use it anywhere else. And I was struggling because like every time I wrote a test, I'd start including other dependencies, and things would then start to get brittle and they break, and then eventually nobody uses the test, right? So it's the same old story that people like often go through, but I couldn't find anybody that really understood the problem that I was going through. Like in terms of, basically it came down to not having an approach to mocking or to substitution essentially. So I was in the lunch queue at Jack's London, where we were doing a talk on, I think it was on Adopt. So we're doing a talk on Adopt, and then I met a guy called Sandro Mancuso, who many of you will know, and of his company Codurance, at least if you don't know Sandro himself. And I said to Sandro that we stood there with our little trays going, I said, dude, I really like, I listen to what you say. I can't get this testing thing to work. And he's like, Jim, it's easy. You're just not thinking about like how you're going to mock out dependencies. Like you need to think about interactions. And there wasn't a lot of stuff around that just explained that. And there's loads of stuff now. So this might sound like, oh, Jim, you just don't read anything. But there wasn't anything that really kind of explained that approach to building software, that outside in or London-based TDD that it's sometimes referred to as. And I went back from that, and I did a prototype in my own time. I learned how to do TDD, and that was it. That changed the path, because the software that I was delivering actually had 0 bugs in, and that's almost unheard of to get to that level of sort of going into production with 0 defects. And within some of the companies that I've worked in, that's been like, whoa. So that's quite different in terms of approach.
Yeah, no, it's cool. I got to say actually a shout out to Codurance, because they're our sponsors of our meetup. So that's kind of a good way to kind of segue into that. But yeah, I think I was
going to say I haven't heard Domino's arrive yet. I thought you were sending pizza to everybody who attended.
Yeah, probably. I just had a few crumpets before that was me done. But yeah, I think it is interesting, because I think in a similar way, I think before I got involved in the Java community, you can quite easily live within this bubble of your organization and the way that your organization does things. And they might do things really well, which is great. They might do, but I think having a broader kind of understanding of what's going on in kind of the ecosystem and the more general community is really beneficial. And I think, yeah, getting out into these community events, whether it's conferences or even just meetups, you just start to have those conversations, don't you? There's you can just share your kind of problems, your concerns with people who aren't kind of in that bubble. So you got a different perspective on how to solve various problems. And like for me, the meetups are a great place for that, but also the unconference format that we talked about before, that's it's just brilliant for that kind of thing, because you're in, I suppose, like the lunch queue is kind of the hallway track at, a conference. It's a bit more informal, you can go to a conference, you can hear a lot of stuff, and you mentioned it before, there's all these new technologies. But if you're coming from maybe an organization who do things one way, it's hard to really kind of relate to them sometimes, I find. It's like, well, that looks really good, that's shiny and amazing, but actually we could never do that in our day job. Even it might be something like TDD, you might think that'll never work here, but then actually having a proper conversation with somebody about it can just be the difference, I think, between really understanding how you make those small changes to, I suppose, become more productive essentially in what you're doing. So yeah, it's cool. I think, yeah, ultimately it's the community that kind of enables that. So yeah, I mean, at this point, has anybody got any questions that they'd like to ask Jim? It's totally okay if not. That's cool. So, I mean, one of the big things that's happened recently for you, Jim, is becoming a Java champion. Now, when I first heard the term Java champion, it's a bit I'm not sure what that means. So I wonder if you might be able to help demystify what it means to be a Java champion for us.
I mean, I'm still confused. No, I mean, so I guess like it's like anything else within all these awards or types of recognition. It really goes down to it's sometimes like an incidental award. So it's not something that you necessarily go out looking for. So I didn't sort of think to myself, like sort of 6 years ago, I want to be a Java champion. A lot of people that I respected were Java champions. So I guess like Kurt Pepperdine, Heinz Kibbutz, Simon Maple, Ben Evans, Martin Verberg, like they all kind of like had this association, and you could look at them and you could say, okay, well, in terms of their Java story, like they've really done an awful lot for the community, and I think there is a big emphasis in community when it comes to being a Java champion, because what you're really doing is you're taking stuff outside of really what you would do day to day, and you're talking to people about Java, the Java ecosystem, how it works, helping people with understanding. But there are different ways in which you can champion things, right? There's all kinds of different, like, I guess you couldn't take one thing and say like, this is the template Java champion. You've got to do these things to attain that award. But it is sort of one of those things where there are similarities in terms of what people do. There is like a formal, like if you go to the Java Champions webpage, there's like a formal list of what kind of criteria people like what they look for. Probably one of the most, I guess, like if you look at it, it's like called being a technical luminary, which is an odd phrase in itself, but that's something else that's within the space. So a lot of, in terms of if I was to look back on what I've done, I think a lot of it has come from my work in the LJC, my work on the EC, working on JSR 310, and probably more recently talking about Graal as a VM and how the JVM executes Java, and also probably the book. Like all those things have been like my public facing things that have kind of emerged into that nomination. And that, you kind of mentioned what is it all about? It's a self-nominating group. So I think there are around 310-ish Java champions. And yeah, the idea is that, you once you're visible, once you've been seen to be promoting Java and sort of talking about Java in either user groups or elsewhere, that nomination process then goes through to essentially like a round of discussion and then a round of voting. And at that point, you kind of become an elected Java champion. And I'm still like, now I'm a Java champion. I'm sort of, it was really an absolute honor to get that title. I say I wasn't necessarily, something that I'd been looking for, but at the same time, it was something I was really proud to achieve. And it's a really great accomplishment. So, I mean, I'm still finding my feet a little bit. So kind of like there is a Java Champions mailing list, which actually often overlaps with the Java user group mailing list. So there's often a bit of cross posting, which is fine. It's kind of like the leaders of the Java community, basically, in those two groups. And I'm kind of like, there is a Java Champions conference. There are invites to go to conferences. A lot of those are virtual right now. So yeah, I'm kind of finding my feet a little bit with it. I'm actually trying to figure out what I'm going to do next. So I was kind of right in the middle of giving this Graal JVM talk, and my plan, as you know, Nick, was to like roll it out over some of the different user groups, to come to Manchester, go to the Oxford Java user group, and talk through the bits from that talk. So yeah, I'm still kind of trying to figure out what I do next. I think it's something I want to use as more of a platform to be able to talk more about Java. And that's really what I plan to do with that.
So do you get a jacket? That's kind of quite important.
I do get a jacket. It hasn't arrived yet. I think logistics are fairly difficult at the moment, but yeah, I'll get a jacket. And we'll see.
I know you've got the Duke in your background with a guitar, but basically you don't have to be a rock star developer. There's various different ways you can kind of achieve to become a Java champion, essentially. It's kind of, I just always have this picture of this kind of one thing that you would need to be to become that Java champion, but it sounds as though there's definitely a lot more angles to it, different ways you can contribute.
I think.
Sorry.
I was just going to say, I think if you think about getting involved with an open source project, which is, a lot of people these days, they say, you probably should be involved in an open source project. And you go, great. Well, what does that mean? And you could be someone writing code. But more important, some of the more important roles are not just necessarily the writing code. It's like the relationship with users. It's the sort of odd things that happen as a result of something in the environment that you might be an expert in. So, for example, I'd like to do more time, but I do some time with the Maven project. I, for example, have helped them do their upgrade to Java 15 recently. So when Java 14 was released, the Maven project on that same day moved to Java 15, the early access builds, to make sure that the ecosystem and the build system is ready for that new environment. I've done some stuff with Robert on actually looking at some of the different problems that have got bugs within Maven to try and get some of the components released. And there's lots of different things where you can get involved. And I think it's the same kind of thing within the Java community. You don't necessarily have to be going into Java util concurrent and patching some stuff that Doug Lee has written to be able to champion Java. And if you think about that, could be either you're writing to champion something, you're running a community, you're basically helping to support the whole ecosystem. And like I said, I feel that Java is one of those ecosystems that does have a very strong sense of community, from from the LJC through to Oracle themselves, and that community outreach is something that they've done historically very well. You've got access to people like Brian Gertz and everyone else who works on the core platform. I'm sure they get bombarded with everybody's opinion, and some of those do get included. But it's a very open community, I think, and even more so since the JDK was open source by Sun right at the end.
Yeah, no, I mean, it is an interesting one, because I think I doubt anybody really sets out and says, I want to become a Java champion. But I think you just got to find things that you're interested in, I suppose, and and passionate about, and get involved essentially, and things tend to come of that. That kind of passion is quite a career enhancer in itself. I think just being enthusiastic about things. I've kind of recently started trying to get a bit involved with the Adopt Open JDK project, and it's kind of, there's just little things that you can do. It's as someone coming new to the project, I struggled to get started. It's well, actually, let's improve those docs, and the next person after me has a bit of a better experience. So you can kind of just chip away at little things like that. That wasn't any code, it's just editing a README essentially. This providing a slightly different instruction that was a bit more helpful. But yeah, it's kind of, ultimately it is kind of just finding those things that kind of you've got a bit of passion for. And it's always challenging, because it's outside of your day job, these kind of things. But if you can do it, it can be good, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely say, if it's going to be outside of your day job, don't do something you don't enjoy. Because you won't do it. That's fine. That's also cool. I mean, the other thing is, a lot of companies are now, I guess, getting involved more in open source, on top of the companies that have been heavily involved with open source for a while. If you've got key systems and business reliance on, for example, Spring, you should probably have somebody that knows about Spring. or at least is involved in that kind of like lower level detail. And some of the, I think there's a lot more opportunity now to make the value of open source quite clear, and that your team members contributing to that for a certain proportion of their time during working hours is not a bad thing. In fact, it's a very good thing for them to do. It's a very good thing for your company overall to be involved with, because if something goes wrong, the person who's going to know how to fix it is likely going to be the person who's been working closely to it.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, cool. I mean, we've covered a lot of ground really in such a short time, so it's great. We talked a little bit about kind of what's next for you, and you mentioned the book that you're currently writing. So, I think, is there anything else to say on that, or we kind of, I suppose you talked a bit about kind of the structure in terms of how you're going to approach it. What's the book about more kind of generally?
Yeah, so the book's titled Mastering API Architecture, which is designed about, it's all about, a lot of companies are doing microservices, a lot of companies are doing APIs, a lot of companies are going through digital transformations of one type or another. And this is really about, like, it's supposed to be a guide that an architect, a developer, or product owner could use to see like the kinds of challenges and problems that you would face, and how you might go about solving those. So it kind of starts off by talking about an introduction to like basically REST APIs and APIs in general, starting to talk about how you test and productionize APIs, and then how you use tools like API gateways to kind of unlock services within your sort of ecosystem. So really talking, if you come across a phrase called traffic shaping or traffic management, it's all about north to south traffic. So that's traffic that comes outside of your company inwards. And that's what the first part of the book addresses, and that gets most people off the ground. We then go on to talking about like the slightly more subtle next step, which is doing the east to west communication. And actually, depending on where you are, some companies will start doing east to west first, but most do north to south first, because you don't have to change very much to do north to south. So when we start talking about east and west, we go into products that are essentially talking about service meshes, and sort of routing through sort of proxies to be able to discover services, and how you kind of build them in a fault tolerant way where the REST is still the right option. So we kind of like gone towards, like, rather than just that kind of clear traffic coming in and out, you might need speed now, you might need to have high throughput, you might want to lower your network bandwidth depending on where you're deployed. So that kind of conversation then starts to evolve. And then we kind of like, after we talked about east to west, we then go into some like useful extra pieces that people should consider. So things like API security being really important. So how does OAuth 2 work? Like the one protocol that everybody knows when they look at a diagram, but forgets when there's no diagram in front of them. That kind of thing, and sort of like digging more into maybe more asynchronous APIs as well. So how would you build for an asynchronous API? And then kind of finishes off with looking at like emerging trends within the API ecosystem. So yeah, there's lots of kind of content that we cover, and the idea is that as developers pick up those books, or if you're trying to own a product around an API, like just to understand like the whole ecosystem, and we're doing it from like both an architectural and hands-on approach. So it'd be kind of that mixture between, this is like what it looks like from a top level, versus this is how you may want to consider implementing the services or the solution.
Oh, cool. That sounds like a good one. And yeah, I think how you talked about how you're going to kind of progress the book, and I definitely think there'll be some good content to be delivered along the way by the sounds of it. Some really interesting topics in there. So yeah, so I'm looking for time. So we've got, let's say, five minutes or so essentially. Are there any questions from anybody on the call? Or is there anything else, Jim, that you kind of think's worth covering while we've got you, that we maybe haven't already?
I think Craig might have a question now, actually.
All right.
A hand has been raised.
Cool. That's what we like.
Hi.
Hi, Craig.
Yeah, just a really basic question. I'm looking to transition to a dev role, and sometimes looking at the requirements, even for basic positions, are almost overwhelming. So I don't know what advice you'd give to someone looking to pick up a junior role?
Yeah, that's a good question, Craig. Can I just ask what kind of role you do at the moment?
Operations, so server deployments, migrations, accidental DBA as well, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Now, I might actually just, first of all, before I give my insight into this, I might actually let Nick answer that question, because I think that's a very similar career path to what you took, right, Nick?
I suppose in some ways mine was kind of, it's almost the reverse, I think. So I was a software dev for years, and I've more recently become more interested in the operational side. And then that kind of materializes more of like an SRE, site reliability engineer type role, essentially. But I do see, like within my organization now, working on an infrastructure team, we have an operations team as well. And we have developers in the operations team who are not, I'm sorry, we have engineers in the operations team who are not developers. So they don't have the kind of same background as me with, like, thinking about software and design and things like that. But they have really strong operational kind of knowledge. They can spot a system is unhealthy like that, whereas it might take me a few more kind of hops in my brain to kind of understand some things that are going on. And I think, so for me, that gives you a great background in terms of understanding systems, because a lot of developers get to, I see it quite often, they're focused on writing software and not really thinking too much about the deployment of that software and how it's going to run in production, how it's going to scale, all these kind of really important questions. So I think your background is kind of ideal to get, to give you a good base. I think, yeah, I suppose the question that you've got is, how do you kind of progress into dev? And I don't know the answer to that. I don't know. Have you kind of seen that before, Jim?
I have, yeah, a couple of times. I mean, I think, like, first of all, I think that, it really does depend, Craig, on what your goal is. If you want to kind of progress to being a developer, like over, say, like a period of 2 or 3 years, then possibly going into like the SRE space and leaning more towards development would allow you to utilize your existing skills and then move over towards that over time. And you'll certainly like be working with developers more closely and kind of learning a bit from them as you go. So you could almost like learn that on the job. I also appreciate that sometimes you just might want a complete break from what you're doing and to do something different. And in that situation, like it can be quite challenging, because actually what I would say is that, like from personal experience and from talking to others, like if you're moving into a dev role, similar to what I did when I'd been doing training for 4 years, and you're going back into software development, you almost feel like you have like an imposter syndrome potentially, where you feel like, oh, I maybe don't quite have enough Java skills to do that yet. So I'm going to go and learn some more Java skills and then I'll do it. And actually, you do that and you put it off, and maybe you do learn the Java skills and go on, or you don't. I'd actually say, like in terms of, it almost comes down to like thinking about what you've already know and learned along the way. So things like, almost like, especially like once it comes to moving into like a junior developer role, or even just a first developer role, like things like, can you break down the problem? Can you kind of like structure and design like the way in which you would build code? And sort of, can you sort of, I guess, articulate problems within code like that? Those 3 things on top of like what you've already got as a skill set. Like, I think there'd be a lot of teams that you could probably even interview in teams now and find out like what they feel like you would need to know in addition. And I think, if you go back, it goes back to like interview technique, but a lot of interviews now, they'll ask you to write some code. And a lot of the time they'll be expecting you to do that using TDD. Like if someone asks you to write code, they're normally expecting you to do it TDD or with testing. So that might be something to just like kind of be aware of. I think probably like within some of the scripting and the DBA stuff, like you probably got quite a lot, like that's half of building an application anyway. So it's more like just on that, how do you structure and put together the solution to the problem. So I think the other thing would be to actually, and there may be someone in the Manchester Java user group that has been through a similar process. But the other thing I would recommend is getting a mentor, because actually, like just thinking through now, there'd be lots of advice like I would give if I knew more about like what you already know. So it's probably worth trying to find a mentor within either within the Manchester Java user group or within another
Yeah,
within your own company, and try and do it that way.
I'm on the LJC's Meet a Mentor, and I've got two really good mentors actually. But it's nice to get other people's opinions as well.
I was just about to
Yeah,
mention that, so that's cool that you've kind of been able to get involved in the Meet a Mentor program. I was also involved in that a little bit back, kind of had a mentor, and yeah, it's definitely a good initiative that they've got going there.
Yeah, I've got somebody from Red Hat, which is I felt quite lucky to land.
Yeah, yeah, no, you can be surprised by who ends up mentoring you. That's for sure. It's definitely a good program. No, I think that's kind of really good advice, Jim. I think
Yeah, the list ends up being quite large, even for a junior role, which isn't always very well paying. Because like even within my organization, we've got very low level service desk staff that earn more than junior programmers. So it
yeah,
feels quite embarrassing sometimes to look at the sort of difference in salaries, especially given how difficult programming can be and this massive list of requirements that they're asking for.
yeah.
Front end, HTML, CSS, some sort of JavaScript framework, JavaScript backend, deployments, database design.
I think it's worth saying, like, I've kind of seen job adverts written before, and it can be quite daunting because people put this spec of all these different skills, but the reality is that, as somebody hiring, I would never expect anybody to have all those skills. Hopefully they have a few, which is always good, but I mean, a lot of it for me boils down to attitude and their kind of approach, being able to kind of communicate well, are kind of as important, if not more important, than having that shiny new framework on your CV, essentially.
I honestly wish companies wouldn't do it. And you've seen one of my job specs actually, Nick, because you worked for me for a while. But the way that we do it is we don't like that big list of technologies. I always wonder whether it's the hiring manager that puts it on or somebody else along the way, because CSS is a very difficult skill to learn, and I can guarantee that most people they can do CSS on their CV can't. I would never testify to being able to do anything with CSS. So it's always interesting because I mean, like I was saying, we don't put that big list out there, and certainly what we're looking for in our team more is this idea of like, can you bring the right mindset and attitude towards solving the problem? Because again, like if you're a good software developer, you could almost be met with any challenge or any application stack and be able to make progress. And that's kind of what I want to see from people that join our group, is that if you're given a problem, can you make progress on it within sort of a reasonable amount of time? Because if we get an insight into that, it's a lot easier for us to hire. And our hiring process, we do things like, we do ask people to know Java because such a large part of our stack is in Java, but we don't make any kind of list of other things that we would ask people to know. And then during our interview process, we would expect people to sort of like be able to just demonstrate that they can like write a very simple example using TDD and critically explain through what they're doing and how they're approaching it. But yeah, it's interesting because like the roles that have like that big list, I think to Nick's point, I would almost with some of them I would just apply, because there's no downside in applying necessarily, and you'll probably find that what's on that list isn't what they ask you about anyway.
Yeah.
Well, this is why there's such a big disconnect for me, because we get contract developers in and I work with them on a daily basis, and I'm always quite disappointed on their skills versus the pay that they're getting.
Yeah, it's interesting.
I mean, there's things that you say and there's things that isn't there? Yeah. And I think, it's always difficult on CVs, because if I could put C++ down on my CV, but I wouldn't necessarily be comfortable to go and work in a C++ team right now, because like it's not something that I would sort of judge myself as being an expert in, or at least competent in, to be able to do a dev role. And I think people that's a very subjective viewpoint, right? There's no way you can objectively say somebody is good or bad at C++ or good or bad at Java necessarily. So I would definitely say, like, don't undersell yourself, like, necessarily. And also, like, a lot of those long lists of technologies are just really bad. I really liked it when people put on things like must have like 7 years experience with Graal VM and things like that, which I don't even been around for like 2 years or whatever. And you do get that sometimes. It's nuts, and you think surely nobody's actually put that out there. And people ask for like, expert in XML. Like, how can you be an expert in XML? Well, you can be an expert in XML, and usually if you're an expert in XML, you don't use it anymore. But there is certainly a lot of roles that are overspec and not necessarily what the company's looking for. So yeah, don't be disheartened by those long lists. And actually, you probably, to your point, like the developers that you see that come in with that long list, they probably do that because that's the long list that they kind of match up the long list. And are they asked about any of that stuff? No. And actually, in many cases, it comes down to, if you have to do it, can you do it within a reasonable time frame? And that's why we assess that skill more than whether you know X technology. I actually don't mind what technologies people know, because that's not as far as if I'm honest, I think there are other skills that people bring to the table. And if I was thinking about my team as an individual team, and I was thinking, okay, if I could hire someone who has more of an ops skill and I can show them the development side, then as a team, we have somebody who's really strong on ops and will become a really strong developer as well. And that would be more what I would look to hire for, is to how do we take like the good things that you have, and you should definitely be pushing those on your CV, and match them up with the role that we've got as well. So you can basically come in and immediately hit the ground running, but we work towards that longer goal of sort of like evolving to what you want to get out of your career, essentially.
Yeah, I was involved in like the technical pairing exercise for one of our interviews where I'm working at the moment, just a couple of weeks ago, and it was the first time I'd done it, so I was kind of just learning a bit about how to run it. So I was kind of more the observer. But one of the instructions that kind of we give to people is, we want them to be as comfortable as possible. We want it to be as natural environment. It's not about coming in and writing an algorithm on a whiteboard. So we tell people, in your normal day job, you would probably use Google and you'd search for things and you'd find out how to solve problems. So as part of the interview, we encourage people to kind of solve problems exactly how they would. So, if you came in with no Java knowledge, we might kind of struggle a bit. But if you don't know how to read a file from disk off by heart in your head, you just Google it. And that's what you would do in your day job. And it's kind of, these kind of, I suppose, job specs can be quite daunting. I think, I suppose it's quite a challenge sometimes just to make that first step and put yourself out there and kind of apply for something, I suppose. But definitely, if you can, do it. Another option, I think it was one of our members of the Manchester Java community, David Underwood. He, I think it was called the Tech Returners program. There's like an organisation in Manchester, I think, and they people exactly like yourself looking to kind of have this career kind of change. So I think he was previously a tester. He went on this Tech Returners kind of program. They teach you the development skills essentially. Now I don't know too much about it, so you'd have to kind of research it in a bit more detail. But you learn the development skills, and then they have relationships with different organisations, such as in the Manchester area essentially, and they start to match you up and pair you up. And I think David actually ended up getting a job for a new company as a developer, and kind of made that transition from a tester to a development role. So there are ways to that. Maybe I can put you in touch with David if you like. That might be something that might worth having a one-to-one conversation to find out a bit more about that and what he did.
Thank you.
Yeah, cool. So we're kind of, the hour's up essentially.
I had one more question. Sorry, it was more technical. Our dev team is quite small. .NET rather than Java. That tends to be more like the 9-to-5 developers, but they're hooked on now to microservices. But it feels like it's a more complicated choice for them given the size of the team, and they tend to get confused about what they're doing. So I don't know if there's any advice that I could pass on or point them in the right direction.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very good question. I think there's, if I was to go back 4 years ago when we started going to conferences on architecture, there was kind of, and everywhere you went was microservices. Like every single, like you couldn't move for microservices basically. Like they were in every presentation. They were the real hot topic. Fast forward maybe 3 years to when we've been going to presentations recently, and there's a lot of presentations about why not to use microservices, or like why to go with a monolith first architectural approach. So you kind of like see a real shift in people, like kind of it's the silver bullet almost, to actually we need to be a bit more careful when we use this technology. I think, you know, there's definitely advantage to using a microservice architecture in some situations, but there are a lot of prerequisites that you need to have in place. So when you talk about a microservice, the reason why you probably want to make it a microservice in the first place is because it's got its own technical product boundaries and it can be reused across different projects. And ideally, by what you're doing is you're essentially putting it in a position where you can like infinitely scale horizontal, or infinitely, that application. So I wouldn't always like rush to get microservices off the shelf to begin with. But they're certainly like an option that you can evolve to. And actually, I would always go with, like personally, is building a component driven architecture in one deployment unit until you've got quite advanced DevOps. And I think because you want to, like the rate of change of these things, you want to be able to deploy it, you want to be able to push new features to it. A microservice, you typically want to deploy, you know, like 10, 20 times a week, maybe. And if you can't do that, and you can't do that within an accurate time frame, it's going to get quite messy. The other side of it is that you're now in a decoupled and non-binary compatible environment. So you've kind of got these things disconnected now. You can't kind of run your compilation and say, yeah, these two things are definitely going to work. So things like testing become absolutely paramount. And that's like across the whole test pyramid. So it's unit testing, it's integration testing, it's actually connecting those components together and doing end-to-end testing ephemerally. If you can't do those things, then you can't necessarily do microservices. So there are a big list of things that actually would stop you from doing microservices well. And if any of those things are true in your like situation, it will mean that deploying a microservice takes longer and negates the point of having it, I would say. So it's kind of like, it's one of those things that the answer is always, it depends. But in general, like it sounds like I've seen this quite a few times where people have gone down that decentralized approach. They've run into problems either with scaling or bandwidth or other kind of scenarios, and they end up pulling the application back in to the bigger application. So it's certainly like, I would say I would be really scared to do microservices without a degree of operational maturity. I think that's probably the best way of describing it. And it sounds like it kind of like that rate of change things, if it's breaking in a lot of different places, or that's why they're kind of getting confused with it. Then things like putting a good versioning strategy on top of that service, or thinking about the protocols that you use, thinking about using something like a service mesh because it allows you to route traffic to new containers. So you can deploy them essentially into the production environment and test them without them being production. Like those kind of like DevOps pieces, I reckon you need to have before you can really truly adopt microservices in a way that's advantageous.
Yeah, it's interesting as well, because I think sometimes, Craig, you mentioned, did I catch that it was kind of one team essentially building lots of microservices, and I suppose sometimes, like in a small organization, there just isn't really the need to kind of start decomposing into various services. In a bigger organization, you start to get those kind of boundaries. And I think Jim touched on it before around kind of technical product boundaries, where you don't want everybody to kind of be re-implementing the postcode lookup service, for example. So you have that in one place, and things like that. But yeah, I think it's really challenging. I think to kind of navigate that landscape of microservices and all the different technologies that you could use and all the different kind of approaches, it's just really daunting. And there is like Jim pointed out, a kind of certain level of experience, I suppose, and maturity that you need as an organization to go into that with your eyes open, because there's going to be more complexity for sure, or maybe different complexities, let's say. And I think just starting with kind of good principles around good design and separation of concerns and all that stuff is really important.
Yeah, there was a really good talk by, I can't remember her name now, but it's a lady who worked at, I think it was the Financial Times, and they'd moved towards microservices. Like they got, I think, up to 150. And they were talking about how it was taking half an hour to deploy each microservice. And then if you times that out by like half of the microservices you want to redeploy them, you're all of a sudden up to like a week or something of deploying and rotating these services.
Right.
I don't know, Nick, if you, maybe I'll ping you afterwards. We can share some links with you, Craig, on like the types of things that you could look at around the architecture. Because it's also like from your previous question, learning about some of the architectural considerations about microservices and when you would and wouldn't is probably going to something that suits your current skill set really nicely, I would say.
Yeah.
Well, just for example, it took, we deployed yesterday and it took a whole day to deploy an update, a whole day. And I just sat scratching my head.
Yeah, sounds like there's something not quite right there, but these things do happen. And I think having, the more you can get involved in that, I suppose, and kind of try and contribute to it in a constructive way, or kind of heading in the right direction, that could be a good way of kind of edging yourself over to that domain a bit more of kind of development and trying to kind of get a bit more hands-on and solving some of the problems they might have.
So have you seen blue-green deployment used quite a bit with microservices? Is that something that's quite common?
Yeah, it is a pattern that's quite common. Yeah, it's also what we use at AutoTrader. We tend to kind of seems to be the kind of default now is rolling releases. So rather than kind of doing a switch over from one version to another, we kind of gradually roll out the new version across all instances. So there's various different patterns, and I think there's a whole kind of big conversation that could go into here. I think like Jim said, what we should do is probably share some good kind of reading materials. I think there's a couple of books by Sam Newman, which are good. I think he's released one quite recently, which is probably, I think if I remember right, it's kind of challenging that kind of decision to go microservices a bit and kind of think more about, do you need to? Because it just took off as a kind of a movement, essentially. And I think there's a book called Microservice Patterns, which I found there's a website that goes with that as well, which is really good. And it talks about blue-green, different deployment strategies. It introduces all the things that Jim's already mentioned, like API gateways and kind of service mesh and stuff. So there's kind of, there's just so much. It's kind of a minefield. There's a lot to kind of cover in that area. I think maybe that's kind of a good one for us to kind of try and line up somebody to come on and talk on a future JVM Lunch, and we can kind of cover that area in a bit more detail, because it's a really interesting topic. So I'll have a think about that and see who we can kind of try and encourage or convince to join us.
Yeah, it's certainly topical for me.
Yeah. No, that's cool. Is there any other questions from anyone? I'll go a little, is there something in chat? So, cool. Yeah, so Helen's just saying, I suppose it's really inspirational to hear more about your journey. Yes, and I'd kind of echo that. Thanks, Jim, for joining us today. It's been really good kind of hearing about your background, and congratulations, of course, on becoming a Java champion. And yeah, I suppose we look forward to kind of seeing you about more in the community over the coming months and years.
Thank you very much, Nia. Thank you everyone for listening. It's been a good session.
Cool.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. I'll put something out for the next month's meetup as soon as I've got something planned. Cheers all.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye. Bye.